Welcome, everyone, to the new year. I'm very pleased to start the new issue of the Seleukid lecture series together with my co-host, Rabbi Ben Scolnic. We have another 5 papers lined up for you until June. And we have a great start today with our distinguished speaker, Professor Stanley Burstein. Before I introduce him, I'd just like to draw your attention again to the upcoming Seleukid Study Day 8 in Utrecht in November this year. The call for papers is still running, and I have a direct link to it in the chat box. There you will also find the link to our lecture series and the full program. And the third link that you'll see, it takes you to the handout with the main sources that Professor Burstein is presenting today. So we are honored by Professor Burstein to take the word today in our lecture series because many of us, I see around there are many distinguished colleagues that are even older than I am. But I was struck that his first book appeared when I started grade one. In fact, he had all his academic degrees already before I was even born, all from the University of California at LA. And even before defending his PhD, he had been appointed professor at the California State University, where he served from 1968 until 2004. That's quite an academic life, or let's say a first part of an academic life, because he has been prolific also afterwards, and his list of publication counts 14 books and far over 100 articles. I got to know his work first as a Hellenistic study, so very important handbooks and source collections on the Hellenistic world. And later on, when my interests extended into the Black Sea area, I saw that Stanley actually started his career with Black Sea studies on Heraclea. And also his latest book publication from last year is again dedicated to Black Sea studies. So I'd be keen to read this as well. And I was also struck to see, how extravagant his interests are. From the Hellenistic world, he also extended into ancient African studies, into ancient Eritrean studies. So this is quite a breadth of academic interest. His lecture today, however, is to be seen in connection to one of our main interests in these lecture series, a subfield of Seleucid studies, namely Seleucid Judaea. We've already heard presentations on the Book of Daniel, on the Book of Esther, on the Maccabees, and one big omission so far was engagement with the Book of Judith. And that is what Stanley is presenting to us today, the Book of Judith and Greek education in Seleucid Judaea. So the floor is all yours, Stanley.
Thank you very much, Altai, and thank you, Ben, for persuading me to look back at a topic I hadn't worked on for, quite frankly, 25 years. Altai, I believe, had at least begun his career then. At any rate, I had got involved with Judith accidentally. I'd been invited to do a contribution to a festschrift for Peter Green, who had just published his big history of the Hellenistic period and was also a successful novelist, among other things. And Judith seemed appropriate. It also tied in with what is a one of my primary interests, which is relations between Greeks and non-Greeks in the Hellenistic period and before. Now, I had gotten involved in that very early, partly as a result of my Black Sea work, and partly because of my work on another non-Greek Seleucid author, Berossus, when I did an edition and translation of Berossus in the 1970s. Now, one of the difficulties with studying this sort of topic is that it is very hard to identify what non-Greek authors, when you have them, might have read in Greek literature. Judith is interesting in particular because it's almost unique in the fact that we can identify some of the authors that Judith used, and we can also see how the author of Judith, and I believe the author of Judith is a man. I do not share M.S. Capernegro's idea that it was a woman. How the author of Judith used those authors. Now, my original paper was called Clitarchus in Jerusalem, which gives you an idea of what I had in mind. I was particularly intrigued at the idea that the author of Judith might have had access to one of the most important and popular historians of Alexander, Clitarchus, and made use of it. That at least was my purpose, and you'll see how that worked out later on. Now, I should make one proviso about what I tried to do in the original paper and what I'm trying to do in this talk. This is not a talk about Hellenization. I'm old-fashioned enough to believe that Hellenization was a real phenomenon, that there were individuals who deliberately sought to assimilate to Greek culture and the Greek identity. But be that as it may, that isn't what concerned me. The issue here is much more focused. It is about education, about the knowledge of Greek by a non-Greek author or individual, and how that knowledge might have been used. And that does not necessarily imply seeking a Greek identity or pursuing a Greek cultural themes. There are, in fact, a couple of other examples from Seleucid Palestine that show exactly what I mean. Altai mentioned a work that has many similarities to Judith, the Book of Esther. Now, Esther, of course, is set in the Persian period. Whether or not it is Persian period is an open question. But roughly contemporary, as we'll see, with what is believed to be the date of Judith's composition, was a Greek translation of Esther that eventually made its way into the Septuagint. And there is an interesting change made in one important aspect of Esther. In the Hebrew text, Haman, the person who tries to organize the slaughter of the Jews in Persian territory is, of course, a Persian. But in the Greek translation of Esther, made, as I say, in Seleucid Palestine, Haman is converted into a Macedonian. And the purpose of his plot is to subvert Persian rule and transfer it to the Macedonians. And the Jews, Esther and her father Mordecai, by foiling the plot, save the Persian Empire. It becomes a story of Jewish loyalty to their Persian overlords and the saving of the Persian Empire. Now, there's no conceivable way that one can ascribe to this rewrite of this modification of Esther a Hellenizing trend. The author knew Greek as his trend and was able to translate into a Septuagint style of Greek. But he did so for his own non-Greek purposes. And the same is true for what I want to talk about with Judith. I am interested in a non-Greek author, a Jewish author, who was, I think, familiar with Greek literature, but used it in his own way. And it's how he acquired that Greek, that is, say, the extent of Greek education that might have been available, that I am particularly concerned with. Even that limited question is important. One of the great books of 20th century Hellenistic studies was E.J. Bickerman's De Gote Maccabeia. And one of the criticisms of it was that, after all, Jerusalem was a backwater, and the sort of Greek education Bickerman supposed was available really wouldn't be available in such an area. Books like Judith raise real questions about that type of approach and suggest that there was much more in the way of Greek literature and education available to Jews who wanted it, Jewish elites who wanted it in Jerusalem than one often assumes. Now, Esther itself, Judith itself, is a peculiar text. Its history as a text is unusual. We have no evidence other than the possible internal evidence of the text itself of a Hebrew original, or the Christian authors who cite it, Origin, or refer to it, like Origen, note that Jews in their time, that is to say the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, had no Hebrew text. There is no fragment of Judith in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And Jerome, who did the Latin translation for the Vulgate, translated it from an Aramaic text, but noted that the Jews in his own day did not have it either. So that the existing evidence for Judith is entirely tied up with the Septuagint. Like other books in the Apocrypha, the dozen or so Hellenistic books in the Septuagint, it was bound with Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Tanakh. It was bound with them and preserved because of Christian uses of the Septuagint later on. The story itself, likewise, does not have too much Jewish resonance in antiquity. The commentator Carey Moore does cite a midrash where Judith appears. Josephus ignores it, but it became, through Christian use, and then in the Middle Ages and later, an enormously popular story, although I suspect not totally familiar now. There are a great many artworks for it, but let me briefly summarize it just so we know the basic story. It is set, the narrative is set sometime in the Assyrian, in the past, certainly before the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom, and definitely before the Babylonian conquest of Judah. That is, say, the main narrative. It is set in a period of the universal Assyrian Empire, ruled over, and this is the first of the many puzzles, Judith, by Nebuchadnezzar, who is specifically identified as the king of the Assyrians who rule from Nineveh. And the story begins with his successful attack on the Medes to expand his empire eastward. We have a Median king named Arphaxad, who we have no other evidence for. But as part of his campaign, the western provinces of his empire were ordered to support him, and the western provinces, or at least the western peoples, including the Jews, refused. After the conquest of the Medes, therefore they had to be punished. He dispatches a great army made up of all of the peoples of the empire who's loyal westward to conquer these people. And that's the second puzzle. The geography of this campaign is utterly unintelligible. No one has been able to make sense of it. But at any rate, the general named Holofernes after subduing various things, finally enters northern Judea, Palestine, and is stopped by the resistance of a town called Bethulia, and he lays siege to it. The siege goes on, and just as the Bethulians are about to surrender, the heroine Judith appears, and she is a pious, beautiful widow who nevertheless resorts to seduction. It persuades the people of Bethulia to let her go to Holofernes to work her way with him. She is overly beautiful, and he decides, after she puts him off and off, that he's bound to sleep with her. And then comes the key of the story. Let me read it briefly. She went after Holofernes gets drunk and is brought into his bedchamber and falls asleep. Judith went to the bed rail beside Holofernes' head. She reached down for his head, for his sword, and drawing close to the bed, she gripped him by his hair. "Now give me strength, O Lord," she said, and struck his neck twice with all her might and cut off his head. She rolled the body off the bed, removed the netting from the post, gave his head to her servant, who put it in a bag. They bring it back to Bethulia. The Assyrians find the body the next day. They are terrified. They flee. There is a great slaughter. The siege is lifted, and the people of Bethulia, the Jews, are saved. There's a great deal more to the story, but that is the key point, and that set me off. Now, the problems with Judith are manifold. As I say, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar is an Assyrian. The geography is impossible. Most of the places mentioned can't be identified, except for Jerusalem, of course, which does get mentioned. Judith is simply the feminine of Jew. So Judith is the Jewess. She has no other history in Jewish tradition. And while she's given a long genealogy, it leads to nowhere. She's not one of the ancestors of David or any famous figure, and so on and so on. So what to make of this text? It is usually left as a puzzle. And as I say, I haven't gone back to it for 25 years. Now, one of the interesting things about these texts, the Apocrypha, is that while they are one of the largest bodies of extant literature, perhaps the largest coming out of a Seleucid territory, they're relatively ignored except for the historical books, 1 and 2 First and Second Maccabees. The other thing that puzzled me, that struck me when I was doing this study the first time, is that there is a huge chasm between biblical scholarship and classical scholarship. It's as though neither side really reads the other. And that includes me. As I say, I didn't do much with it. I only got interested in Judith by accident. And I was an outsider, and to some extent, I am still an outsider. But there were some things that I did see in the scholarship 25 years ago that were agreed on. One of them was roughly a date. There were 2 possible dates at that time: Persian period, for reasons I'll come back to, but most scholars believed it was written in the post-Maccabean period and during the Hasmonean period, in the late 2nd or early 1st century, at latest BCE. Second, there was no doubt that it was written in Palestine. And the other and final thing is that it was fiction of a sort. The real question is, what kind of fiction? And there is less agreement. There have been several recent commentaries since the one I used, which was published in the 80s by Carrie Moore. That's the one I used in the Anchor Bible. That's the one I used for my original study. There's an important commentary by L.M. Wills, which treats Judith as a Jewish novella or short story, similar but earlier than the Greek novels. And he's written extensively on this theme. In that sense, Judith, for him, is simply an entertaining fiction, a good one, but an entertaining fiction. That particular approach has also been taken by Eric Gruen in one of his important studies of diaspora Judaism, in which he refers to the, as he calls it, the puckish character of the author and an audience that is prepared to laugh at the various puzzles in Judith, the various elements, and so on. In short, Judith is simply fiction. Now, the problem for me with that is twofold. It was, first, even bad fiction has a purpose. One of my earliest papers was on the playwright Menander, who was also treated as entertainment. And I tried to point out in that paper, and other people have done similar things, that even Menander wanted to make points, contemporary points, in his entertainment. And this is true, as we know, for all kinds of entertainment, of television shows, and so on. That's the first thing. Saying it is an entertaining fiction doesn't free us from trying to understand what the author might have wanted to say along with entertainment. The second and more serious problem is that there is no evidence that Judith was ever read as that kind of fiction, either in antiquity or later. St. Jerome says that the Jews of his time grouped Judith with the historical books in the Bible. And that's understandable because the author goes to considerable length to use the forms of biblical historiography in setting Judith. It starts from the very first line. He says, he begins the book, "It was the 12th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, who ruled over the Assyrians from his capital Nineveh, that Arphaxad was ruling over the Medes." It starts as though it's a chronicle, and as you read through it, it has all of the sort of conventions of biblical narrative history. Now, read this way, of course, there were still problems. Then the problem of Nebuchadnezzar, the Assyrian, is the biggest one, since everybody who knows the Bible knows that he is always he's always king of Babylon, and the Babylonian sources agree. That was known in antiquity, and there were attempts to get around that problem by treating the book as a sort of code, written in code, and assuming that under Nebuchadnezzar, some other king was mentioned. Antiochus IV was one possibility because Holofernes orders all the temples of the kingdom to be destroyed and people to worship only Nebuchadnezzar as God. Okay, and the Christian chronicler Sulpicius Severus in the 5th century suggests maybe Nebuchadnezzar is code for Artaxerxes III, although I don't think he has any problem with the Jews. So that had been the solution. Yes, it was some kind of historical book, but written in code. And there are modern scholars, beginning after Martin Luther, who was the first major intellectual to say that Judith was fiction, modern scholars who tried to identify who was really being talked about. I suggest that yes, Judith is a kind of fictional history, but that it's a kind of fictional history that, oddly enough, is not really all that unusual in the Hellenistic period. If I suggest that what it reminds me most of is Plato's Atlantis, I'm not trying to be extreme. Plato's Atlantis is actually intended to be a fictional history of Athens, of events that occurred 10,000 years earlier. And it cites all of the conventions of Herodotean historiography to do this. There are other fictional travel accounts and so forth, and it continues right on into the Greek novels, who also set themselves out as though they were histories. This sort of thing was so common that the geographer Eratosthenes complained about it loudly, and even the later pagan emperor, Roman Emperor Julian, complained about people who take these sort of fictions as fact. I suggest that Judith is a kind of Jewish version of a history-like work set in the distant past that serves both the purpose of a good story and a good story that has a point. Now, the question gets down to particularly what concerns us, because in the 25 years since I dealt with these problems the first time, scholarship has moved on, and it's moved on in a surprising way, relevant to what I want to say, but a surprising way. 25 years ago, it was taken for granted, even though there was no trace of a Hebrew text of Judith, that the author of Judith wrote in Hebrew, or conceivably Aramaic, since Jerome refers to an Aramaic version that he translated. And that the similarities between the Greek of the Septuagint and Judith were due to the translator, who translated a Hebrew book into Greek and faithfully reproduced Hebrew idioms in his Greek. That was simply assumed, and everything about Judith at that time assumed we were talking about a Hebrew author. In the 25 years since then, there's been a remarkable change. L.M. Wills continues in his commentary to argue that Judith is originally a translation of a Hebrew text. But his is becoming, interestingly, a minority position. The other major recent commentary by Deborah Guerra, pardon me, argues very strongly, and she is not alone, that the original language of Judith was Greek, and that it is a Greek book by an author who is literate in both, certainly Hebrew and Greek, but it was originally written in Greek, and that's why we have no trace of a Hebrew text. And her argument is based on a rather rigorous analysis of the language of Judith, in which she points out that while, yes, there are Hebraisms in Judith, there are equally importantly turns of phrase that are Greek and cannot be rendered in Hebrew. And she has quite a long list of those. Now, if Judith is originally a Greek written in Greek, then we are very much in the question of what was available in the form of a Greek education to an author like the author of Judith. Now, it is very difficult to identify what non-Greek authors read of Greek literature unless they either literally quote something or they tell you what they wrote. In the case of Judith, the evidence for what the author read consists of parallels, close parallels that are too close to be accidental between the text of Judith and Greek texts. The first one was pointed out by a German scholar named Grintz and in English by Moses Haddis. And it is one of the first items on the handout. Just before Judith enters the scene, the siege of Bethulia has resulted in drought, in the loss of water, food, and so on. The people are begging the leader, Uzziah, a man named Uzziah, to come to terms with Holofernes. And he tells them, all right, they will wait 5 more days and pray to God to help them. And if at the end of 5 days nothing changes, then he will accept terms from Holofernes. Grintz and Haddis point out, and it's the first item, first translation, that this is extraordinarily close to a story of the siege of the city of Lindos on Rhodes by the Median general Datis, that is preserved in a spectacular inscription known as the Lindian Chronicle. There, of course, since it's the Temple of Athena, the Lindians pray for 5 days. They tell Datis they'll surrender in 5 days. If Athena doesn't save them, Athena does, the siege is lifted, and so on. Now, obviously, the author of Judith wouldn't have known the Lindian Chronicle, but the Chronicle source is certainly a Rhodian history, most likely Zeno of Rhodes, and that might have been available. This type of identical parallel is what one has to look for. Now, in Judith, what struck others was there were similar parallels, very close ones structurally and narratively with Herodotus. There was one possible literal reference to Herodotus in which Holofernes tells the Western peoples to have earth and water ready. Now, earth and water is, of course, in Herodotus, what the Persians demand for a city to surrender. There is no other reference in all of Greek literature to this practice. So to suddenly appear a reference, even slightly different in application, of earth and water as signs of some kind of submission suggests Herodotus. Edi Molignano and others pointed out close structural similarities between Judith's account of the siege of Bethulia and the narrative, and Herodotus' account of Thermopylae, the Battle of Thermopylae. The most important one, which I'll come back to, is Holofernes, just as Xerxes in Herodotus, asks for an explanation of who the people he is opposing are. And an Ammonite general one of his allies named Achior, gives him a potted history of the Jews to tell them why they will hold out and ultimately be victorious. It is very, very close structurally in every respect to the narrative of Xerxes and Emeritus, the Spartan exiled Spartan king. And there are further similarities. Now, those two are generally accepted. The author of Judith had access to a Rhodian source and to Herodotus. What interested me the first time was the puzzle of the story of Judith's attack on Holofernes. Because while the idea of a feminine hero isn't really unheard of in the Bible, Deborah, the judge Deborah, is one, for example. The particular act of cutting off the opposing general's head, bringing and by a seductive woman who seduces him, gets him drunk, bringing it to the enemy camp, so on, that is unusual. The usual explanation is that the author of Judith was inspired by the story of Yael in Judges 4, which is connected to the story of Deborah. In that story, Yael, as Judith, is deceitful. She invites the fleeing Canaanite general Sisera into offers him sanctuary. He goes to sleep. She takes a tent peg and a mallet and smashes his head open with it, and then shows the mutilated body to the locals. Now, Judith's author may have gotten the idea for killing the general by a woman and saving his people from the story of Yael. But there's absolutely no similarity between what Yael is supposed to have done and what Judith is supposed to have done. And in fact, as I tried to show in my original paper, and it added a piece, the only parallel to it was in yet another Greek text, or at least what would have been a lost Greek text, but reflected in Latin sources in Curtius Rufus' History of Alexander and the Metsepitome, of the killing of the Sogdian general Spitamenes in 329, is murdered by his wife in a remarkably similar way to the death of Holofernes in Judith. Now, this is a series of Seleucid talks. I don't want to over-interpret that. I think the author of Judith had seen Cleitarchus. Cleitarchus is the source, the clear source of these two texts, and took this episode from it. I think that is, the parallels are so close. The scene, the weapon, what happens, the murderess, what happens to the head, and so forth, that it's pretty hard to ignore the probability that that was his source. And that was my case then. As I say, I don't want to over-interpret this. I have a bunch of Seleucid historians here. If you think about it, it's interesting. What happens to the head and when it comes to Alexander is intriguing. Alexander, in Curtius Rufus' account, is horrified. This evil woman, and he drives her away. In the Metsepitome, he likewise does not accept the head, but for a different reason. Now, it's worth noting, who is this evil woman? Well, the wife of Spidomenes is probably the mother of Apama, Seleucus I's wife and queen. And probably Clitarchus slipped in a slur about her family, her mother. I don't think the author of Judith went that far, but he did, I think, pick up the story, saw it as useful, and used it this way. So at that time, I could add to Herodotus and Herodian source Clitarchus, the most popular history of Alexander, and this wouldn't be all that unusual. It would have circulated in Syria, Palestine, since it was an Alexandrian history work, would have been likely available. All of these usages, and I see I'm getting a little time, all of these texts, however, are examples where a theme is used. They don't really affect some basic interpretations. I'd like to close with a couple of points that go further and raise some particularly interesting questions. First, the big puzzle. Why is Nebuchadnezzar king of the Assyrians? The current interpretation from Wills and others is that it's a tip-off to the readers that this is fiction. And it certainly would have startled any author, for instance, any reader who was familiar with Daniel. But I don't think that is what is going on. My late colleague, Ben Wacholder, pointed out that the problem of Hellenistic Jewish historians was to fuse biblical historiography and Greek historiography. Deborah Guerra has pointed out another author that the author of Judith seems to have known, Ctesias, the 4th century author of a Persica, whose Persica was the authority on Oriental history, on the history of the world empires. Berossus had already criticized it. Now, in Ctesias' version, as well as in later Greek historiography in general, there is no Babylonian empire. The world history is a series of universal empires, going Assyria, Media, Persia. If Nebuchadnezzar is the ruler, as the author of Judith wants, of a world empire, then he must be the ruler of Assyria. Because the Babylonian Empire doesn't exist. I suggest this is a case where he has tried to fuse a Greek scheme of the succession of empires with biblical historiography. And of course, it works better because in even Ctesias' version, Babylon is an Assyrian foundation, the second royal city of the empire. That's the first example where his needs have begun to interfere with, you might say, biblical historical tradition. There is a second and more remarkable one, which has passed unnoticed. And I didn't notice it until I went back for this talk. In Achior's speech to Holofernes, he presents a short history of the Jews from Abraham to the rebuilding of the temple. Chronology is, I won't go into why the chronology is mixed up there, but the rebuilding of the temple. The theme of the is that the Jews have no longer have retreated from sin. They are pious again, loyal to God, and therefore they are unbeatable. And that is shown by the rebuilding of the temple and so forth. Now, this sort of short overview, there are several of them. There is one in Strabo, probably from Posidonius. There is one in the historian Justin, taken from Trogus Pompeius. The striking thing about Achior's overview is what is missing. The Exodus is there, but Moses is missing, and the entire monarchic period is missing. There is no reference at all to the monarchic, to the Davidic or kingdoms or the later. And more than that, the Exodus story is astonishing. In the Exodus story, as Achior gives it, the Jews properly go, of course, to Egypt because of famine and drought. They prosper, they are made slaves. But then he says, the Jews cried out to their God. He afflicted all the land of Egypt with innumerable plagues. So far, so good. That's the biblical story. So the Egyptians drove them out. That isn't the biblical story. That's an astonishing variant of it. That's the story that is usually considered the anti-Semitic version, the story you find in authors like Manetho or Pseudo-Manetho, like Lysimachus, so on. And it occurs elsewhere. There is no Pharaoh reluctant to hold the Jews back. There is no destruction of the Egyptian army. The Jews are simply driven out by the Egyptians to free them of the plagues. And when they get to the Red Sea, God dries it up. They cross over into Sinai and Judea and conquer Judea. The whole Passover story has been rewritten in a way to, you might say, Judaize the version that the author appears to have found in a non-Jewish source. Judith's fictional history, therefore, is a very complicated text. Now, I've got a few minutes, and in a few minutes, to suggest why his point is perhaps presumptuous. I don't think it can seriously be considered Hasmonean propaganda for the monarchy. As I say, the entire history of the kingdoms not only are gone, but the kingdoms are a period of sin, apparently. That doesn't work for the Hasmonean king, for propagandizing the Hasmonean kings. Judith presupposes that the proper government of the Jews is a state centered on the temple and ruled by priests, the high priests. Now, is there some point where that makes sense in Seleucid Palestine between the Maccabees, because this certainly is post-Maccabean, everyone agrees on that, and let's say the Hasmonean, the first century. And interestingly, there is one episode that combines a siege of Jerusalem, a potential threat to the Jews, and what must have seemed miraculous salvation and punishment of the Seleucid king who threatened Jewish freedom. And it's the one that is never mentioned. The campaign of Antiochus VII in 129 where incidentally the blood libel first appears in Greek texts, even though and and the story, of course, ends with the high priest Hyrcanus bribing, but the Jews wouldn't have known that, Antiochus to leave, and he gets killed during the campaign, and the Jews are miraculously saved. I do not think we're talking about propaganda, but yet another miraculous salvation from a threat would be in a good time to inspire an author to produce the kind of fictional history we have in Judith. And it is a kind of fictional history that emphasizes that freedom for the Jewish state is part of the divine plan and is to be preserved at all costs. If you compare it with a contemporary Egyptian diasporic text, Third Maccabees, you'll discover there is one big difference. The message of Third Maccabees, which is also an entertaining story, is that no matter how the Jews are persecuted, they are loyal to the kings. And that loyalty is recognized by the Ptolemaic king, Ptolemy IV, in the story, and is rewarded. Judith is not a story about loyalty to the Seleucid kings. It is a story about independence, and independence from a fictional past to the present. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stanley, for this really interesting talk. Before I ask my questions, we have someone much more qualified to give you feedback, and that is Rabbi Ben Scolnic, whom I actually need not introduce in this group because everyone knows him well for his biblical and Seleukid scholarship. But I just point to one of his latest publications in the field of the Seleucids. That's the Seleucids at War, Seleukid Perspectives, volume number 2, and also some of his ongoing work, which will be Jewish responses to the Seleucids, on which we are working together. I leave it at that and pass the floor to Ben.
Hey, thank you, Altai. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I do.
Great. Okay, so first of all, thank you so much, Stanley. I pushed you to do this, and because when I read that earlier article from 25 years ago, it made me look at Judith in a new way. There's a Yiddish word chutzpah, which means audacity, presumptuousness, something like that. It's chutzpah for me to even say I agree with you. It's also additional chutzpah because I saw Eric Gruen is here. That's very intimidating because of what I'm going to try to say. But please understand that if I try to bring some bits and pieces, it's out of respect to everybody. So here are the points that I think that I got out of some of the points, because Stanley made so many wonderful points. Here's a few of them. Judith reflects knowledge of Greek history and knowledge in 2nd century Judea and Samaria. Judith is not just entertaining fiction. It has a serious theological belief in reward and punishment. And I know this is a little bit harsh, but I think calling it a comedy with a wink is a kind of modern prejudice against it. Judith may have been written after the siege of Jerusalem and the death of Antiochus VII, and I'm going to come back to all this. And I think also the activities of John Hyrcanus in the north. And we can read Judith with both Greek and biblical perspectives. So I hope that that's a summary of some of his points. Because of Stanley, I went back and I read Judith as if for the first time. Here's the first line, and Stanley quoted this. It was the 12th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, who ruled over the Assyrians in the great city of Nineveh. So just to go over a couple of the things he said, Nineveh was the capital of Assyria. It was destroyed in 612 by the father of Nebuchadnezzar, who led a coalition including the Medes. So Judith chapter 1, verse 1 is historically incorrect in two ways. Nebuchadnezzar did not rule from Nineveh, and he was not an Assyrian, as Stanley was talking about. Now, and again, I think I'm just adding on to, I'm riffing off of things that Stanley said. I'm not saying that Judith is not confused about aspects of history, but the confusion was shared by Greek sources, and this mistake could have come from there. So here's a couple of examples. This is from Herodotus. When Cyrus had made all the mainland submit to him, he attacked the Assyrians. In Assyria, there are many other great cities, but the most famous and strongest was Babylon. So this is what I think Stanley was talking about, that there was this confusion of Assyria and Babylonia. And the strongest was Babylon, where the royal dwelling had been established after the destruction of Nineveh. So here's another example. Cyrus lived well after the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and yet Herodotus speaks of Babylon as Assyria. We might dismiss this as a simple mistake if it weren't for the fact that he isn't the only historian to do this. Another example is Xenophon. Forthwith, Cyrus pressed on towards Babylon, his troops in battle order, but as the Assyrians did not come out to meet them, so these are, the point is, and I'm trying to do this quickly, Judith may have been drawing from Greek sources. And I think this is what Stanley was saying. Even the mistakes in Judith show, that they're basing themselves on Greek sources. But I'm still on that first verse, because I read the 12th year of Nebuchadnezzar, and I say, wait a minute, I know that date. How do I know that date? In Daniel chapter 2, at least according to the Old Greek translation, they talk about the 12th year of Nebuchadnezzar instead of the second year. So in Hebrew, there's the word shtayim, which means two, and shtei Misrei, which means 12. And so scholars, long before the discovery of a Papyrus 967, had suggested that 12th is correct because it makes a lot more sense contextually. I'm going to try to get to this point. Here's Nebuchadnezzar's rule. Instead of saying Nebuchadnezzar was an Assyrian king back in the Assyrian period, let's take Nebuchadnezzar seriously, that name seriously, and let's remember that he started to rule in 605. So 603, 2 years is too early. But by the 12th year of Nebuchadnezzar, 593, the first exile had occurred in 597. So Daniel chapter 2 has the 12th year of Nebuchadnezzar. Can it be a coincidence that the book of Judith starts in the 12th year of Nebuchadnezzar, and that very year was in Daniel chapter 2? And so now I move on to verse 3. In the 17th year, he mustered his forces against King Arpachshad. Stanley quoted this. Now again, Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem in 587, 586, the 18th into the 19th year of his reign. So the 12th year that Judith chapter 1 is talking about and the 17th year that verse 3 are talking about are before the destruction of Jerusalem. Most of Judith, if not all of it, is set in the 18th year, right before the historical Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, destroyed Jerusalem. So here's Judith chapter 2. In the 18th year, on the 22nd day of the first month, there was a discussion in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Assyrians, about taking revenge on the land. Hold on. Okay, now I'm sorry that doesn't read well, but what I'm trying to say is I'm following Stanley. I would not call this, I'm trying to do it so it's legible, I'm sorry. I would not call this fiction, but alternate history. Imaginative space can be geographical. Think of the Odyssey finding imaginative space in geography, or the Sinai Peninsula finding imaginative space in the Hebrew Bible, or chronological. So Judith seeks chronological space for its alternate history. The story is placed in the 12th and 17th and 18th years, which are before the 19th year. So it's before the destruction. So in this alternate history, as I'm suggesting it, Nebuchadnezzar never gets to Jerusalem. He only gets as far as Bethulia. It seems like in this alternate history, which I know sounds crazy because we know what history is, but in an alternate history, it's like an as-if thing. It's as if he never destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, because the temple still stands in this book. So if this is after, in the time of Cyrus or something like that, right? The temple is standing. After Judith saves the country, we see the high priest Joachim coming from Jerusalem. We see that the temple is still standing. We continue to read. And this is in chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but just glance through this. There's a whole description of Ecbatana, taking up 4 or 5 verses. And I'm saying to myself, why in the world would you be emphasizing the walls and the cubits and the height of Ecbatana? What does that have to do with the whole book? And you're taking up a part of the first chapter to do this? And then I'm saying, wait a minute, where have I seen this before? I've seen this someplace, and I couldn't remember. And then I realized Herodotus has a whole discussion of, and I have it here, about the height and the walls of Ecbatana. So I'm saying, wait, there's something strange. This I don't believe in coincidences. Chapter 1 of Judith has a description of Ecbatana, which has nothing to do with anything. It has nothing to do with the book. Why are we describing the walls of Ecbatana? And yet we have a discussion of the walls of Ecbatana in Herodotus. So I'm thinking, I'm following Stanley Burstein. I'm saying, you know what? This author had all sorts of things, right? He had Clitarchus and and Herodotus. I think that Stanley's absolutely right that we have to read for both biblical and Greek sources, and this author knew them. That there would be, just to say it one more time, a discussion of the walls and height of Ecbatana in Judith, and that you find it in Herodotus, must be something. So is this based on that? But I'm still wondering, why Ecbatana? Who cares? Who cares about the walls of Ecbatana? I'm going to come back to this. So Cyrus is the one who conquered Ecbatana. The last meeting king fell not to Nebuchadnezzar in 593, but to the Persian Cyrus. The Nabonidus Chronicle says the following. King Astyages called up his troops and marched against Cyrus, king of Anshan, in order to meet him in battle. I'm skipping a little. Cyrus marched against the country of Ecbatana, the royal residence. He seized silver, gold, other valuables of the country of Ecbatana. He took his booty and brought to Cyrus. So in history, Cyrus conquered Ecbatana. In the Book of Judith, Nebuchadnezzar conquers Ecbatana. And that's how the whole book begins, with that conquest. Who cares? Why are we talking about Ecbatana? And now, again, following what Stanley was talking about, I'm thinking about John Hyrcanus, who became high priest in 134. And as Stanley was talking about, he besieged Jerusalem for a year, forced him to agree to tear down the city's fortifications and renew tribute. And so marching east, so what did Antiochus VII do after that, I asked myself. He marched east with what would prove to be the last great Seleukid royal army, by the way, including a unit of Judean troops under John Hyrcanus. And he restored Mesopotamia and Babylon and Media to the Seleukid Empire. And the Parthians come, and guess where Antiochus VII dies? In the Battle of Ecbatana. Right? Can this really be a coincidence? I'm trying to back up with little bits and pieces Stanley's idea that this was written after the siege of Jerusalem, maybe after the death of Antiochus VII. It was like Antiochus VII got his, and then within a few years, John Hyrcanus took advantage of political turmoil, and he extended Judean control over Judea and it should be in Samaria. So when was Judith written? And agreeing with Stanley, I think it was written after the death of Antiochus VII and the conquest of the north by John Hyrcanus by a resident of Dotan. Why do I mention Dotan? Because the Book of Judith keeps mentioning the city of Dotan. Who cares about the little town of Dotan, except for maybe somebody who lived around there? And what is Bethulia? I'm not sure that Stanley mentioned this in the talk today or in an email to me, but Bethulia is an interesting name. there wasn't really a town of Bethulia. I think I'm getting this from Stanley. You'll have to correct me. But could it be Beit Elia, like house of God, Jerusalem without calling it Jerusalem? And I found in John Malalas that he claims to, so he gives a description of the Book of Judith and says it's not about Bethulia, it's about the siege of Jerusalem. Was he onto something? Did he intuit something? So what if we suggested this as a wild theory, that it was written after Antiochus VII had besieged Jerusalem, and that's what the siege really is about, as Stanley suggests, by a resident of Dotan and around there, about Yehudit, the Jewish woman, as Stanley was talking about. Yehudit means Jewish woman, around Shechem. Now, we bring into play ideas about the Samaritans, because John Hyrcanus had there was a whole relationship about, I'm not saying that very well. We don't think enough about the Samaritans, and this was in an area of Samaria. Could it be after John Hyrcanus had taken over that area, but putting it back into a period before there was a schism between the Jews and the Samaritans, back to this older time, again in a kind of alternate history. And they use the word Israelite a lot, and that's common to both Jewish and Samaritan. There's details about the landscape around there. So I think, so I'm thanking Stanley, and mostly for the idea that Greek and biblical perspectives show that the author had both, reflecting the knowledge of Greek sources in 2nd century Judea. And we thank Stanley for showing us a fresh way to read Judith.
Thank you, Ben, so much. I guess, Stanley, you would like to respond.
Well, I basically have no problem with what Ben said. He made sense of the chronological problems in a way that I've never seen before, and I think it's not at all unlikely. I'm a little dubious when one gets into the, for instance, should it be after John Hyrcanus' conquest of Samaria? The problem at this point is, of course, in an alternate history, the author's point of view might very well be that Samaria always should have been Jewish, should have been. And so he would, in his alternate history, it would be an aspiration rather than a reference to fact. And this is most of Ben's points strike me as entirely reasonable and illuminating. You should write them up because there is a tendency in this scholarship to go looking for specific connections. Now, I brought one up with an Antiochus VII's campaign, but more precise ones. So, for instance, there is a theory that takes the date down into the first half of the first century because Judith is a powerful woman, and it's dated to, I think it's Salome, because an influential female figure is around. This type of precision strikes me as over-interpreting. But I think Ben is right on most. The connection between Herodotus is real. He's added more to it. As I say, Ctesias is another one. We do really have to assume that Jerusalem may have been a small town, even a town like Dotan he mentions. But if you had money enough to get an education, there was far more available to an author like the author of Judith than we tend to assume. And this is for Seleucid studies, this is a significant fact about even a provincial area in the Seleucid Empire. There is much more available. It's not just Antioch. Wherever you could get an education and had the money for it, there was a great deal possible. And Judith is a kind of witness to that. Just as I say, the translations of Esther and one could add Ben Sira, another book that from the Apocrypha that shows clear knowledge of Emeritus, the Epistle of Jeremiah. I mean, this material is very much available, was available. That was my main point. I think Ben has added a great deal to it. I would like to have a copy of those notes.
Thank you. So while the audience is still thinking about questions or comments, I would also like to add a few thoughts which basically support your entire argument and support the interest in the Greek sources, not direct sources for the account, but rather sources that were in the back of the author's mind. So when I reread the Book of Judith this morning after many, many years, I was struck by the name Bagoas as the servant or the kind of chamberlain of Holofernes. Of course, that of the servant chamberlain of Darius III that Alexander found in the court, in his court, and then also played some important role in his own court. And this is attested in Curtius Rufus, whose main source was Cleitarchus. So I do think that this is barely this cannot be coincidental. I assume possibly that has already been pointed out in commentaries, but that is one. It's a very neat observation. I think I can add one detail when it comes to the not just chopping off of the head of Holofernes, but even carrying it back home. So the Spitamenes context that you have given, including the interpretation of a potentially anti-Seleukid slur, is very convincing to me. But the additional point of bringing back, carrying home the head, that reminded me of Kiomara, the wife of the Galatian or Tolistobogian king Ortiagon, after the campaign of Manlius Vulso, so shortly after, in or after 189 BCE, a story originally told by Polybius and then preserved in Plutarch's De Mulieribus Virtutibus, or De Mulierum Virtutibus. So that may be well, and if if that should be the case, then the likeliest source for the author of Judith knowing it would be Polybius. So one would have to ask when Polybius would have been known. So it's in the early 20s. So it would be in the first edition of Polybius, which would be around possibly in the later 140s. Or 130s. So beside these two observations, I have one direct question. Why did you not challenge the assumption that there is a Palestinian origin or a Judean Palestinian origin? For me, the alternative history with an alternative space sounds much more like something from outside of Judea, the diaspora, perhaps even Babylon, considering that Nebuchadnezzar is no longer the evil Babylonian king, but an Assyrian king. That might also be reconciled with the Babylonian context. So I wonder.
Well, there are 2 points. The first one, you're right about Bhagwas. Actually, I do have something in the old article. Holofernes is also the name of a general of Artaxerxes III. And then there are a series of Persian period references in the text, or at least institutional references, which had suggested a Persian period date for Judith. But once you put Clitarchus in the picture, this all disappears, because Clitarchus, beside having to say something about Persia in his history, is the son of a man named Dinon, who was the most important historian of Persia in the 4th century. So that this material was available, is likely to have been in Clitarchus' history, or conceivably Dinon's if one wanted. So that the Persian period material tends to disappear. Now, why didn't I challenge the Judean origin? This is of course, a case of hadn't gone into everything, but there's also been a kind of revolution in the study of the Septuagint. It's kind of fascinating to see how things changed in a quarter century. I mean, when I was writing, it was taken for granted that the inspiration for the Septuagint came, despite the letter of Aristeas and other Josephus and Philo, came from the Jews of Alexandria, that they did it for their own purposes. And the story that Ptolemy II inspired it, and it was done with the support of scholars from Judea, that was all fiction. Now, currently, the most recent studies all say that yes, it's been elaborated, but really it's likely that Ptolemy II did inspire it, and the Septuagint is, the basic story is true. This is kind of hard thing. But there is this tradition of not just alternate histories, but the very use of the biblical style, of Septuagint style, in other works in the Apocrypha that seem to have Palestinian origin. The Greek translation of Judith, the translation of what is usually called Ecclesiasticus, the Wisdom of Ben Sira, the Epistle of Jeremiah, so that the couching of this as though it were a biblical history, and the author's familiarity, if the original language is Greek, both with Greek literature and his intimate familiarity with the language of the Septuagint, suggests a Western origin. Would it be Egyptian? I mean, there is this bad habit of saying, well, everything is, if it's not Judean, Palestinian, it's Egyptian. No, I don't think so. It does not read like any of the texts we can associate with what seems to be Egypt. Nor does its emphasis on independence really work well for Babylon in the Seleucid period. Certainly doesn't work well even in the Parthian period. It is most, I think, at home in Judea. But it is in the and this material. I could add one other example of this type of material being in Judea from Ben's own friend. The last chapter of the book of Daniel, the historical section that Jerome and Porphyry comment on. If you read that, that's clearly got to be based on some kind of Greek chronicle that was available today in Judea. Because the level of petty detail in it, and accurate petty detail, is astonishing. It's like Ben's question about why the business with Ecbatana. I mean, Daniel didn't need a detailed chronicle of the ins and outs of Seleucid Ptolemaic diplomacy, but it's there. I mean, so I think it works best in a Palestinian context. It is similar to other texts that seem to have that kind of origin. But yes, alternatives are possible. We're dealing with an anonymous text. What can I say?
So thank you very much also for this answer. I have actually promised to leave you off the hook at 12:30. So I do wonder whether this is then the right.
A little bit more.
If you have a little bit more, then I would encourage others to ask their questions. And of course, one of the purposes of this series is also to bring us all into touch with each other and then to have follow-ups via email or on other avenues. So very often our lectures are not the end of a conversation, but rather the beginning. So anyone else? I would have, of course, much more trying again one to follow up on one trace that might lead actually into Asia Minor. It's not just that I think that the Babylonians are no longer the villains. So this points to Babylon, and then we remember that Antiochus III settled settled families, soldiers in Western Asia Minor, in Lydia, shortly after 200. These could could form the potential context. And add to this one detail, the role of Holofernes, or the name. Orofernes was a Cappadocian puppet king established by Demetrius I, and I think I'm certainly not the first who has connected the book of or the representative of the great king in the Book of Judith with the puppet king that Demetrius I sent into Cappadocia, and that was perceived as a strong threat to the Attalid kingdom as well. The Attalids were allies of the king Ariarathes. I've forgotten the number, maybe the sixth or so around that time. So this was seen as a very oppressive and dangerous action of the Seleukid king Demetrius in alliance with Alcimus, and seen as an oppressor of the cult by those hardliners. So perhaps one could spin something around it. I don't want to argue for such an early date of the version that we do have, because there are some other aspects that point to a later time, as you, Stanley, and Ben have pointed out. But here I see a potential connection that might make sense, and that would also explain a potential Jewish Babylonian perspective.
There is in the mixed up geography of this text. There are a couple of things that are might say Seleucid. The eastern, in the mixed up geography, there is an eastern reference to, of course, the empire extending to the Hydaspes, which is, he's probably got that from Alexander. But the western one is intriguing, and you're bringing the second century Seleucids into it. There's a constant reference to Cilicia, but nothing further west or north. And that does suggest something about the second century Seleucids, who have lost much of Asia Minor north of the Taurus. This author's geography of the Great World Empire doesn't seem to include Asia Minor north of Cilicia and the Taurus. And that's interesting. The East is kind of bizarre. There is admittedly a reference to lid and foot, but everyone is kind of, this is all bizarre. What the heck they are. But the march geographically is bizarre, but Cilicia seems to pop up as a kind of extreme point. And that's odd. You're bringing in, I don't want to play the game of trying to find too many specific references, because at a certain point you find them everywhere. But I do think it is odd. The Apocrypha is odd because this is actually the largest body of texts that originate in the Seleucid Empire that we have, if you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't think of them that way.
Thank you, Stanley. So I do think then, if I don't see any other hand raised, this may be a good point to end our lecture today by thanking you, Stanley, once again for your excellent presentation, and you, Ben, for your very helpful feedback. And we have already bridged to our next lecture, our upcoming lecture, which will be a talk by Dr. Selga Medenieks. It will be on warfare, Shemitah, and volcanic forcing, a new perspective on the causes of famine in Judea during the Maccabean revolt. And it will also include some reflections on the siege of Jerusalem under Antiochus VII. So some more opportunity to continue today's discussion. Thank you to everyone, and hope to see all of you soon again.